The Netflix film or series Cleopatra Backlash is silly. Before I get to talking about who Cleopatra was in real life, I think it's important to discuss Egypt's much more interesting neighbors, the Nubians or Ethiopians. That's with an A at the beginning. Indigenous to what is now southern Egypt, Sudan, and South Sudan. The border that makes South Sudan was literally made in 2011. The whole thing is Sudan. The Nubians are a matrilineal African peoples indigenous to the Nile and North Africa, whom are just as old as their sister peoples, the Egyptians, though the Nubians unified a little bit later, but are far more interesting and have so much more unknowns about them to discover and uncover in archaeology and research in general, and had princes that had to gain the approval of their mothers, the Kandakes, to become kings. While Egypt was an African civilization, it was not the sole African civilization of the Nile or North Africa. I bring up Nubia because it would have been a far better choice in examining the indigenous North African cultures, even more so than the cliché choice of Egypt. And while I'm unaware of any Kandakes who became pharaohs, the Nubians didn't need women to become pharaohs, because the Kandake position was equal or arguably superior to that of the title of king, for the reason that I mentioned earlier, and that was only one of the reasons. There were many more. This is on top of the fact that while Egypt influenced Kush, Nubia influenced Egypt just as much, if not more so. The relationship between the two African powers going back to their origins, not just limited to the 25th dynasty of Kemet, or that time period. No matter what the racial background of Cleopatra was, Kush is a far more unique choice in examining North African history. So Netflix kind of messed up from the start. It's the fact that Cleopatra's father's heritage was Greek Macedonian, aka Mediterranean or Southern European. But apparently her mother's heritage and her paternal grandmother's ancestry is debated. Most scholars seem to agree that Cleopatra's mother and her father's mother were Greek Macedonian, or mostly that, due to the incesty elitist nature of, and I'm going to butcher this name, Platormary or Platami or Ptolemy royal family. But some scholars believe that her paternal grandmother was either a Nubian or Alexandrian, secondary wife or concubine. Other scholars believe that Cleo's mother wasn't Cleopatra V, but possibly Egyptian or some other African native group. Native Egyptian. But again, there are those that have doubts. Regardless, this shows that Jaden Pinkett Smith's film or series depicting Cleopatra as being biracial isn't completely without merit. It's possible, even if only by a little bit. Besides the fact that Afro-Egyptians and mixed Afro-Egyptians, not all of them being Nubian or Axumite, which those definitely did exist, founded Egyptian culture and thus did exist. In reality, the Nubians are so interesting and are so powerful and unique that they deserve their own set of videos. It's kind of disrespectful to be bringing them up in this conversation about Egypt, much less Cleopatra. There is so much more to Africa than Egypt, hence why I barely ever talk about Kemet, because it's cliche, but here we are. In order to better understand Kemet, it is also good to research and understand its indigenous African neighbors, since it is in Africa. With all that said, where was the backlash? The modern Egyptians wanting to sue about the centuries-long institutional racism towards Nubians and Afro-Egyptians within modern Egypt and the Arab Islamic world in general. Where was the backlash of having ethnic British and American white actors playing Egyptians, often without said film at least having African and Middle Eastern extras? Where was the backlash against the hundreds of years of intentionally covering up the existence of Nubians and ignoring other native Africans of North Africa in the mainstream, whether it be history, documentaries, fiction, whatever? The only reason some African descent people, namely African Americans, have historically latched onto Cleopatra being undoubtedly African is for the same reason Nubia, Egyptians, African blood, and other native African ethnic civilizations still are not mainstream. The same systemic racism within the voices of the Arab Islamic world and the white Christian one. And we'll elaborate more about what I've just talked about pretty soon. Ancient native Egyptians didn't have an anti-African origin or culture, duh. Even their relationship with their sisters, the ancient Nubians, was complicated. It had its highs and its lows, back and forth. Modern Egyptians have such a disdain for the African roots of their origin, largely because of what took place in the relative far future, closer to our current era. The Arab Islamic invasion of North Africa and the Arab slave trade, which predate the anti-African racism and Christian radicalism of the transatlantic slave trade and the white Christian colonization of the continent. These events, thus, were the major shift in changing the hearts of indigenous Egyptians' views of their Nubian, Afro-Egyptian, Aksumite, and just African blood in general, of their African mixed race as well kin. Thus, the misogynoir, general racism, and other aspects of anti-African intersectional hate from the Arab Islamic world, combined with the white Christian Afrophobia of colonizers like the British, is the reason modern Egypt tends to systemically, subconsciously, and culturally despise their African roots, the matrilineal line. With some of the mysteries surrounding Cleopatra's heritage, leaving it perhaps open to some interpretation. Without the historic anti-African racism within the hearts of modern Egyptians, I'm not convinced that modern Egyptians would have been offended at the casting of a biracial actress as playing Cleopatra at all. This oddly placed backlash reflects the larger issue of shame many North Africans unjustly feel towards their African origin. White Latinos and even Americans of European descent, such as Andrew Reisner, erased Nubia because of the threat the existence of the Nubians posed to the Eurocentric and Arab-centric historic revisionism of Egyptian and North African history in general, as well as the threat Nubia posed solely on its own, being such a fantastic peoples and civilization, existing on its own as one of humankind's oldest civilizations and peoples. From the ancient powerful Nubians to the Dinka, Tobo, Fulani, Tuareg, and Beja, etc., Africans are indigenous to North Africa and within the Sahara, not just below the Sahara. Netflix Cleopatra being described as black by some angry modern Egyptians further reflects their disdain for their African connection, as the actress is biracial. But any amount of African blood is seen as a nasty blemish. Maybe Netflix should have made this project about the Kandakes or a confirmed Afro-Egyptian person instead.